starting out, 5 things you need to know about California water. I had planned this talk before yesterday, so I am going to quote the governor, but it's not from yesterday's press release. It is from something that he said in October, a couple weeks before the election. There was a convening at Stanford where he gave a talk on water, and he stayed and spent the day and was really contributing a lot to the discussion. And when he started out his talk on water, he said that the first thing that you need to know is that water is complicated, right? And it's true, and that kind of can sometimes make it wonky and boring. But what it means is that there are no silver bullet solutions. I did a radio show this morning, callers calling in with their silver bullet solutions. You know, there were 5 or 6 different ones. If we just did this, right? Usually, many of those things are good ideas, but they're just not the whole solution. And you know, I'll quote Felicia Marcus on this. Also, she likes to say that what we need is an all-of-the-above approach. And that's really true. And I think that that's reflected in a lot of the approaches that water managers have been taking and state leaders have been taking. But it's important to remind people of that because a lot of times the public and folks in specific regions who are not kind of looking at the whole big picture don't necessarily get that. It's important to remind them. And then I think the other aspect of water being complicated, it's not just that there are no silver bullet solutions, it also means that there are almost always unintended consequences, even of stuff that just seems like a no-brainer. And I will give you an illustration now that's something that's very popular and there's a lot of activity on. A lot of public interest, a lot of public dollars right now available for recycled wastewater projects. Seems like a good idea, you know. Instead of just treating the water and sending it out to the ocean, capture it, reuse it again, at least once, maybe more than once. Here's the catch, and not to diss it, but more water reuse often means less water going back into the stream, where it might have ecosystem benefits, or where somebody downstream from you might be counting on it. So that doesn't mean we shouldn't do it, but you got to think about it in a regional context, not just every little community on its own. And I see Celeste nodding her head here. This is a huge issue in the Santa Ana River watershed, right? So it doesn't mean we don't do it, but you got to think about the consequences. And sometimes that means it's not a silver bullet. So, okay. Second point. This is one with a little shout out for California agriculture. We're a state that has a lot of orchards, as we all know. Been hearing a lot about that lately. We have to go after more than the low-hanging fruit. How do you like that? I do not say low-hanging almonds, but so, you know, and this is not to diss low-hanging fruit. It's delicious. It's easy to get. It's tasty. You know, but usually when we talk about low-hanging fruit solutions, those tend to be the kind of incremental, not too hard, piecemeal kinds of things, the ones everybody agrees on. And those are great as far as they go. And I'll just, you know, something like conservation, I think, is a perfect example of something that you can kind of do. We have been doing incrementally. It's been making a big difference. I mean, Fran at the board and her colleagues, they're going to ask us to do a bigger jump right now. But still, it's the kind of thing that you don't need necessarily the big, hard decisions on. But it's not everything. And we do have some things where we're going to have to reach higher and make some tough decisions. And I'm just going to, you know, give you the one that comes first to mind for me, which is the Delta, where incremental, everybody agrees kind of solutions are not going to get us to where we need to be on that. And we need to recognize that and you know, have the leadership to make the tough, expensive, and politically difficult decisions on it. So that leads right to the third point. And that is, you know, kind of to the point that sometimes people like to talk about win-win solutions. And again, I think that win-win is possible sometimes, but water solutions almost always involve some winners and some losers. And, you know, it's obvious in places where there's some really key trade-offs like the Delta. You know, and we've written this numerous times and it's not been popular. You know, it's just not possible to find a solution that's going to make everybody better off because the system as a whole is just not capable of doing that. There's going to be trade-offs that are going to make some things worse for somebody there. whether it's Delta farmers, whether it's farmers in the San Joaquin Valley, whether it's the urban users of Delta water, whether it's folks upstream who are, brought into a solution, or whether it's the fish and wildlife, or some combination, or all of the above. I would say it's going to be all of the above if we don't do anything, but there's going to be some combination of folks who are not going to do well, and you have to keep that in mind in thinking about how you decide on the right policies and how you package them. But here again, it's not just for these big hard things where you have winners and losers. Some of the things that we like to think of as win-win also have some loser aspects to them, at least in terms of costs. And an example of that is flood protection projects that provide ecosystem benefits. And the idea of, say, setback levees, moving levees back, giving more room to the river, better for habitat, maybe better for groundwater storage even, can provide better flood protection for the folks who are behind those setback levees. But typically it costs more. So somebody's got to at least think about paying for that. And that's not a big loss maybe, but still you got to think about that structure. Now, as a society, we can aim to pick solutions that provide sort of the most overall benefits. And then I think we have to think about who's not benefiting or who's losing out. We cannot realistically compensate everybody for every penny that they're losing, but we definitely can think about policies that help to ease those transitions. And I think that in California we don't do enough of that in terms of thinking about direct compensation for people that stand to lose a lot. Okay, point 4, bring us back to the drought. This is something that we've heard all through the drought. We've been hammering on this. Crisis creates hardship, but also opportunities. I was tempted to quote Rahm Emanuel on this, but I don't know. Don't put a good crisis to waste, right? And I think the real value in California water is that it creates room for making major reforms that are not possible in normal times. And really, if you look at California in recent years, we've had our share of crises. And that's been really beneficial in terms of some major reforms. I think in some ways we're living in a time that's tough, but also full of reforms. So with bold action by leaders at the local level, at the state level, at the federal level, just name a few, 2007 flood legislation, which essentially doubled the standards for urban protection in the Central Valley relative to federal standards. We're still figuring out how to implement that thing, but basically something really bold. And that came in the wake of, we had some of our own flooding and some lawsuits, but also we benefited in a way from Hurricane Katrina. And we're able to kind of communicate to folks that we faced a lot of the similar kinds of risks. And that enabled legislative action on something that was tough. Second, the 2009 legislative package. That was third year of a relatively moderate drought. We adopted a package of bills that required more conservation, that required better water use reporting, which has been really useful to the state board during this drought. And it also implemented a new governance structure for the Delta, which is key to helping to make progress in that region. So now with this most recent drought, which is much more severe, last year, historic legislation on groundwater. 100 years after the water code was modernized, where groundwater did not find a place back in 1914 in that structure. Now we've got a really solid framework for getting a handle on this very important resource for us. So in all of these areas, much work lies ahead in implementing them effectively. And I'm not by any means suggesting that all the major reforms have been done. We need reform still on water finance if we're going to be able to address some of our hard things. And those are going to be heavy lift reforms, I think. At least we're suggesting that in some of our work. The task for California's leaders is to seize opportunities for change, not be scared of them, and then carry through with the really painstaking work of implementation. Okay, 5, and then I'm going to hand over the mic to the panel. I hope I'm not sounding like this is all like hopeless. I don't want it to be. I don't want it to seem like California's water problems are daunting. So I wanted to end on a sign of hope that it's hard work, but it's not hopeless. We've been making progress in addressing a lot of key challenges in California, including improving the reliability and the quality of water supplies, preparing to weather droughts and floods. And I think the toughest and most conflict-ridden challenge that we face in California water is reversing the declines in our native aquatic ecosystems, which have been failing despite decades of really hard efforts, well-focused efforts, investments, and laws, and we're just not getting it right yet. But even here, I think we can point to some promising approaches. And I'm just going to give you a couple. One is the example from Puda Creek near UC Davis, where they have reintroduced natural variable flow patterns with just a fraction of the water that nature originally provided, and it's favored the return of native species. And if you read Peter Moyle's blogs on the Davis, California Water blog, they even had salmon show up this year, which he was quite amazed to see. And then another example, also up in that area. I don't know if there's a coincidence this stuff is all happening up near UC Davis, Jay, but you know. So there's the example of Nags Ranch in the Yolo Bypass. So Yolo Bypass is already one of those examples of unintended consequences, but a favorable unintended consequence, where it was built as a flood bypass to protect the urban areas in the early 20th century, and it turns out to be great habitat. And so it's just, you know, been a really lucky thing that we did that, given all of the wetlands that we destroyed everywhere else. But what the researchers have now been doing, working with farmers, is figuring out that it could be great not just for birds, but also for fattening up baby salmon. By just letting the water stay on the fields a little bit longer gives the salmon a much better chance to make it down back into the ocean. So these are both creative examples from a playbook of what's often called reconciliation ecology. And that's kind of the approach to ecosystem management that our group has been promoting for some time now. And it's really, you know, the philosophy is kind of a pragmatic approach to managing ecosystems alongside continued human uses of water and land resources. And we just think that it's really important to make more room for creative experiments and innovations of this type. And that's going to make us feel like we can get a better handle on our aquatic ecosystems. So just to wrap up, these 5 immutable facts about California water: it's complicated. We've already eaten most of the low-hanging fruit. Solutions create winners and losers. Crises help us make progress. And it's hard, but it's not hopeless. These are going to be guiding the work of our center. We think that California needs to ground policy decisions in reliable, nonpartisan, science-based diagnoses of the problems and the potential solutions. And that's how we, along with our research partners throughout the state, hope to contribute to a better water future.
Well, nice to be here. Nice to see the turnout, too. So we have with us here an interesting group. We have, to my right, Matt Rodriquez, who is the Secretary for the Environmental Protection Agency of the state of California. He's probably got the most interesting job in Sacramento because he does air, wind, and not fire. You don't, but he does recycling. He has 6 different boards that he oversees. It's definitely the overview of the state. Karen Ross is the Secretary of Agriculture and Food. She comes from the wine industry and actually gave up a job where she traveled the world tasting different wines to come to Sacramento. Yeah. And Rick Frank, who teaches law at UC Davis, and has a long tenure in the environmental law and water world. He was on the Delta Vision Task Force, and he's currently on the High Speed Rail Authority, which I think makes him the star of glutton for punishment category. So we'll get going with the questions. So the first question is, many Californians were amazed when the governor's drought relief package allocated more than half the funds for flood control. Why is flood control the priority when the state is dry? Secretary Rodriquez?
Well, let me start off by first saying what a pleasure it is to be here today. And let me also note that Secretary Ross told me that she left her notes and her talking points back at the office. So in a show of cabinet solidarity, I left mine over there. So, so God only knows what I may say.
Yeah.
Let me just say this, that several years ago, the governor had an event here in San Francisco that talked about extreme events that we're going to experience in California as a result of climate change. And we know that drought is one of the things that we'll experience with climate change. We also know that extreme events such as flooding and heavy rains can be another part of the equation as well. And so as we're looking at water, as we're looking at water issues, it is to our interest to take a look at the full range of issues that we may have to deal with as we're dealing with water issues. And so even though we're in the middle of a drought right now, it's a reminder that we're dealing with climate change and we're going to be dealing with floods at some time in the future as well. And there was funding there. Proposition 1E funding was there. And frankly, I think it was going to be unavailable after 2017. And so now seemed like a good time to be spending those funds when we were thinking about extreme events and we were thinking about water. And then to a point that was made earlier, there can sometimes be co-benefits of those things. Our ecosystems are going to suffer as a result of climate change. They're suffering right now as a result of drought. If we can make our ecosystems stronger by doing flood control programs, for example, and a little bit more resilient, that's to our interest as well. So we're thinking water, we're thinking extreme events, we're thinking about how can we maximize the benefits to the state by spending some money right now and dealing with our water issues. So it seemed like dealing with flood control and building some resilience in California seemed like a good thing all the way around.
Easier to make those repairs when there's no water in the canal.
And that makes it easier as well, yeah.
Okay. So the Chronicle letter writers have been quite active this week and certainly today. And they asked almost daily why the governor has asked for individual cutbacks from you and me and them, and not so much from agriculture. Shouldn't the state be encouraging more conservation and water reuse from farmers, they ask? Secretary Ross?
Yes, this is a drought that everyone has a role to play, and every citizen has to understand how precious this resource is and use it the best that they can and conserve as much of it as they possibly can. The fact is, for agriculture in the state, and thank you for not introducing me as the Secretary of Almonds, because I thought that's where you were going to go this week. It seems to come up. I don't know how that is.
Yeah, can't imagine why.
The fact is, agriculture, the way the water system works, our cuts have happened, and they are actually very, very harsh under our water rights system. So last year, when there was a voluntary goal of 20%, agriculture got 0 water allocation from the federal project, which was the first time ever. I think it ended up being about a 75% reduction from the state water project. There were curtailment notices throughout the state from the State Water Resources Control Board, so agriculture had less water. I think the UC study that we commissioned estimated a reduction in surface water availability of 6.6 million acre feet. And we used groundwater, which is what groundwater was designed to do during times of drought, to compensate for 5 million acre feet. But we had 1.6 million acre feet less water being used in the agricultural system. And that resulted in over 400,000 acres being fallowed. In that fallowing were not just annual crops. There was also over 40,000 acres of trees and vines that were pulled out. Those are hugely capital-intensive crops to make a decision to pull them out. And we estimate that about 17,000 farm worker jobs were lost or displaced. The direct economic hit to just the agricultural community, meaning that was just less money circulating in the economy, was $1.5 billion. I'm a small country girl, I get billions and millions mixed up. So that was one way that agriculture has given. It's also very interesting over the last 50 years, it may not sound like much, but over the last 50 years, because we've made so much progress with conservation on the farm and at the water district level, we're using 5% less water than we did, but our value has more than quadrupled, meaning that for every drop of water that we're using, we're generating better economic value for that. which is a more efficient way. We've moved to high-value crops, which has hardened our demand because many of them are those permanent crops. So agriculture is aligning itself around where the consumer demand is. We grow for markets, not just because we like to grow it, and we have to make harsh decisions sometimes to pull it out. We've invested in conservation on the farm. We have over 50% of the acreage and maybe closer to 60% of the acreage that's using some sort of precision irrigation technology. We feel that there are a number of other things that can be done. I would love to see, and this is where we're talking real money in the billions, but if we could modernize our irrigation districts and those canal systems and do all that we could do in automation in that regard, it would be very helpful for just-in-time delivery of water to the farm, and then marry that with the efficiencies that have been made, whether it's the irrigation system itself, whether it's really doing the education and outreach and decision tools to help farmers do all of this data that they need to know exactly how much water at exactly the right time and at exactly the right amount. All of those things will result in savings. There's tremendous opportunities here. The last thing I'll note is that we have started to make those kinds of investments with the governor's leadership. Last year, the drought package included $10 million for a statewide water efficiency program. We've invested that. It was a competitive program. They had to save water, and they had to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by reducing their energy use. The first round of that is completed. We've invested in 156 projects that should save, based on the estimates, about 317,000 acre-feet of water over the lifetime of those projects. The drought package that was approved last week has another $10 million for that kind of investment that we're making to get those benefits out for the public.
Thank you. So the Secretary mentioned water rights, so we'll tee up the next question here for Rick Frank. California currently relies on a priority of water rights to determine water allocation rather than considering the current conditions or the effects on water quality and fisheries. Is it time to revamp California's system of water rights?
I very much look forward to answering that question, but before I do, let me add my congratulations to PPIC, to Mark, Ellen, and the other very talented people at PPIC that are launching this initiative. I firmly believe, as someone who labors in this vineyard a lot, that PPIC, along with Lester Snow and his California Water Foundation, are at the cutting edge and the leading thinkers and policy advisors, if you will, to California state government. I think they perform a tremendous public service. The short answer to your question is absolutely, in my view. We have a water rights system in California that was developed, really embedded at least a century ago, and many of the principles go back literally to the time of statehood, 1850. And it creates a system that really is, to put it mildly, counterintuitive in terms of modern conditions and needs. The system is based largely, though not exclusively, on the appropriative rights system, based on first in time, first in right, which sets the basic priority system of water rights. And in 2015, that leads to some very anomalous results that don't make much sense to a lot of folks. And continuing to focus for a moment on agriculture, you have a lot of agricultural users, for example, in the San Joaquin Valley that are absolutely, with respect to surface water rights, are getting hammered right now. But you look at the same time, a number of agricultural interests in the northern Sacramento Valley and the Imperial Valley are doing quite well, certainly relative to their counterparts in the San Joaquin Valley, and certainly with respect to another number of urban users as well. And the question is, does that make a whole lot of sense? The other thing is that the water rights permit system, the basic system, neither requires nor, until very recently at least, encourages conservation. Which I think is a major flaw. And to their credit, the current members of the Water Board and the Governor's office are doing the best they can to do workarounds around the basic water rights system to address that glaring deficiency. And then finally, the water rights system really doesn't in a direct way account for and protect environmental values. The environment and environmental values are kind of like the kid with his or her nose at the window of the candy store looking in, because the basic water rights system, the appropriate rights system, doesn't really account for, respect, or accommodate those interests directly. To be sure, and to be fair to our the Water Board, which really runs the oversees from an administrative perspective the water rights system, is doing the best it can to manage this system, and it has a couple of overarching tools, weapons, if you will. The Article 10, Section 2 of the state constitution, which requires that all water use in the state be reasonable, and the public trust doctrine, which the California Supreme Court told us in the iconic 1983 Mono Lake decision was a key attribute of California water law that had to be respected and applied concurrently with this antiquated water system. But that's tough. It's tough politically because it's difficult politically for water regulators to impose across the kinds of across-the-board equitable reductions in times of drought that I think most of California's 38 million residents would just assume is both logical and easy to implement. There are a few instances where in law where environmental values are expressly recognized. I think the most prominent of that is the 1992 Central Valley Improvement Act, where Congress required that 800,000 acre-feet per year of Central Valley project water be set aside for environmental values. But unfortunately, that's very much the exception rather than the rule in federal water policy and California water policy. And I'll just close by saying, you know, in times of drought such as this, environmental values tend to be the first to be sacrificed. So I think, to answer your question directly, I think we need to fundamentally revise California water rights systems to resolve these inequities, and particularly to make the environment a co-equal player at the table.
Sort of the gold rush approach, you strike your claim for the water. So next question, Secretary Rodriguez. Water markets, though still limited, are helping to determine water allocation in the state and incentivize conservation and adoption of new water use technologies. But California is the food basket for the nation, and from that perspective, the highest and best use of California is to produce food, not house people. California water policy is thus a national issue. How do we reshape our water policies to support our agricultural economy and water our growing cities?
This is where it's beneficial to be working in a whole number of areas. As you suggested, you know, Cal EPA is air and pesticide regulation and toxics, and so I've seen over the last 3 years how all those things interrelate. And one of the primary missions I think that we have at Cal EPA is to make sure that when we're making decisions, we're looking at a variety of perspectives and understanding how everything interrelates. So I'll tie that back in then to when I look at water, I really fall back on the experience I've had in the last 3.5 years in dealing with the Air Board and designing our program to deal with climate change. If you look at our program to deal with climate change, and it reflects what Chair Marcus said about all of the above when you're dealing with water issues, we're doing the same thing in climate change. We're looking at, okay, can we change the fuels that we use so they're not as carbon intensive? And so we're having fewer emissions. Can we use it more efficiently so that, that we don't have to use as much energy? And are there changes that we can make in our lifestyle and the way we design our communities that reduce the amount of energy we have to use? So we've got a wide range of programs. We're doing the same sort of thing with water. It's not as obvious to everybody, though I would encourage everybody, and this is my only prop, it's not a talking point, but it's the California Water Action Plan that was worked on last year, and finalized last year. We actually started it in 2013, and we saw that California needed a new approach to water. And so what we were looking for is, okay, let's identify the range of water resources that we have in California, be it surface water, be it stored water, be it groundwater. Let's think about desalination and water that we may get from it. Okay, so how do we use our water? What are the uses? Where do we need to commit water? Where are the issues? What are the issues that we need to deal with? Are there ways that we can use it more efficiently? Do we have to use as much? And so we're sort of bringing that same analytical approach to water issues right now. And so, in implementing that, it requires that we at the administration level all sit down and talk to one another. And I think that this report, which was prepared by Secretary Laird of the Natural Resources Agency, Secretary Ross, and myself, is indicative of the approach that we're taking at the administration level, which is I need to understand the impact of what we're doing on agriculture, because I fully understand agriculture was, I imagine that we had a tough year in 2013, but I remember in 2012, the figure we were using was it was a $44 billion part of our economy. And one of the things that strikes me, we've been dealing with the province of Ontario and talking to them about climate change recently. And the Minister for the Environment from Ontario was saying, I'm very concerned about climate change in California because so much of my food in Canada comes from California. I have an interest in making sure that California has very successful programs. It's a constant reminder of how important California and California agriculture is to North America, if not the world. So a long-winded way of saying we're all working collaboratively to make sure that we're looking at all the issues that relate to water in California. The Water Action Plan is representative of that. It sort of lays out some of the issues that we want to deal with in the next 5 years. I will say that in preparing the water plan, we started to look at a number of issues that we've been dealing with recently. So for example, in the plan, we identified that we needed to have better groundwater management in California. That was before the legislation went through. So we're trying to take that sort of long-range look at what we need to do in California, see how all the parts fit, see where our priorities should be, and make sure that we're working with a wide variety of stakeholders, with all the sectors in California that use water, and that's all of us. And try and make sure that we're making the best decisions and that we are testing out the all-of-the-above approach to see what works, because we realize that we need to really look holistically at how we deal with water and water issues in California.
Which brings me to the surf or turf question. Given the amount of water it takes to grow feed and livestock, can the biggest dairy state continue to raise livestock and provide adequate flows for our fisheries? Secretary
Well, it's not almonds. So I know this makes me sound like a cheerleader, except that because I came from another state, I so appreciate and value the diversity and bounty of what we produce here in California. No other state has the kind of diversity of crops, and the livestock sector is included in that we have here in California. And we're very foundational to being a part of the tourism sector. $100 billion economy, $25 billion spent on culinary tourism, because we do food and wine and craft beers better than many other places. So we have had this luxury of abundance, so to speak, to be able to diversify that way, which is kind of like compare it to your stock portfolio. We all want to be able to diversify. We are the #1 dairy state. We have approximately 1.5 million dairy cows in the state. That's a lot of cows. You can thank me that there's less cows now than there were a few years ago, because I'm also the person who regulates pricing back to the dairies, and we've lost a number of people getting ourselves into an economic balance, but also as they've absorbed more and more air and water quality regulations, it's really started to shake things out, which has been very, very painful. What I would say is that milk and all the things we can derive from milk that are part of our food ingredients here and around the world is still a very efficient delivery of nutrition. And when we talk about what California grows, milk is one of many products: fruits, vegetables, tree nuts, lean proteins, milk, and the way we can take all of these components out of milk and use it in different ways is a very critical part of that. What we have to pay attention to is how do we improve the water use within that particular sector. There's a lot less feed being grown in the state than there was 3 years ago. Of course, 3 years ago, the industry was turned upside down because of drought in the Midwest. We are still feed deficient. We were importing it from the Midwest, and because of their drought, feed prices more than doubled, which really turned the business model upside down. So where they can grow their own feed, they will. But that's a lot of the fallowing that we had last year, and we will continue to have more of that fallow. There's no doubt about it. But the water that's being used, again, it comes back to what Secretary Rodriquez said. We're really trying to look at things in a more integrated, systematic kind of way and really think about multiple benefits for every drop that we use. The dairy lagoons themselves can be used for fertilizer. They're methane that we can use for generating electricity. We have a program under the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund to invest in dairy digesters that address air issues, water quality issues, can reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and the digest that comes out can replace fertilizer and be a very, very good way of building carbon in our soils. So we're trying to create those kinds of multiple solutions for the industry that's in here. Past model in dairy, add more cows, that's no longer economically or environmentally feasible. Number of cows can generate huge dollars back to the state and are creators of jobs in export markets.
Thank you. So I need the fish side of this question. So given the concerns about the balance of farm, city fish use, do we accept the extinction of some native species? Is that what we're going to have to do to have enough water?
I don't think we accept it as a matter of policy. We shouldn't, and the lawyer in me would be remiss if I didn't point out that the law says we currently can. Both the federal Endangered Species Act and California's counterpart make it clear that we can't allow that to happen. It's a legal obligation of our public trust stewards to avoid that to the maximum extent possible. That said, I think some of my environmental friends rely too heavily on the Endangered Species Act as a tool to preserve threatened and endangered species such as the Delta smelt. And just as it took, I guess, Richard Nixon to go to China, it took former President Clinton's Secretary of the Interior, Bruce Babbitt, a committed environmentalist, to have the street cred, if you will, to call out some of the deficiencies or limitations in the Endangered Species Act. And, well, he was speaking about the federal act. This criticism, I think, applies to the state version as well, and that is that there are two basic flaws. First of all, the Endangered Species Acts, plural, are single species focused. They look at individual species rather than on an ecosystem basis. The other problem is that the Endangered Species Act adopts what, again, former Secretary Babbitt referred to as the emergency room approach to environmental regulation, that the requirements and protections of that legislation don't kick in unless and until a particular plant or animal species is listed. And drought circumstances such as we have now, I think, demonstrates the severe limitations of that kind of resource management system. I would submit that we need far more ecosystem-wide tools to address these ecosystem-wide problems. So I'm enough of a realist to think that in the current political environment, reform of the federal Endangered Species Act is not in the cards in the foreseeable future. But again, as Ellen said, out of crisis comes opportunity, and maybe our state political legislative leaders will use this crisis as an opportunity to revisit and maybe adopt some additional and in some ways more effective ecosystem-wide regulatory and legal tools.
Thank you.